On a September evening in the early 1900s, honeysuckle garland hung around the sprawling front porch of a brick mansion situated on a bluff overlooking the East Fork of Mulberry Creek. In the distance, the lights of Lynchburg, Tennessee twinkled 2 miles away. Horses and carriages lined the estate's drive, and a single Oldsmobile gleamed in the moonlight, the only automobile in the entire town. That car belonged to one man. The mansion belonged to one man. And the whiskey that flowed at the party inside belonged to one man. His name was Jasper Newton Daniel, though the world would come to know him simply as Jack. Standing barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, wearing his signature black knee-length frock coat and wide-brimmed country squire hat, Jack Daniel cut an unforgettable figure as he greeted his guests. His bright, almond-shaped eyes surveyed the room with warmth, and a sincere smile spread beneath the broad mustache that cascaded over his upper lip. Inside his mansion, a Steinway grand piano sat in the corner of a second-floor ballroom, where community dances would last until the early morning hours. But behind this picture of success and celebration lay a story far darker than most visitors knew. A story of abandonment, of tragedy, of an empire built from nothing, and of a death so strange that it would become the stuff of legend. To understand the mansion on the bluff, we must first understand the boy who dreamed of building it. Jasper Newton Daniel came into this world sometime between 1846 and 1850, though no one can say for certain when. A courthouse fire destroyed the birth records of Lynchburg, leaving his exact birth date lost to history. What we do know is that he was the youngest of 10 children, born to Callaway and Lucinda Cook Daniel, a family of Welsh, Scottish, and Scots-Irish descent, struggling to survive in rural Tennessee. But Jack's entrance into the world came at a terrible cost. His mother, Lucinda, died shortly after giving birth to him, likely from complications of childbirth. Before he could even learn to walk, before he could speak her name, before he could know the warmth of a mother's embrace, she was gone. It was the first tragedy in a life that would be marked by many. Callaway Daniel, now a widower with 10 children to feed, did what many men of his time would do. He remarried quickly, not for love, but for necessity. His new wife, Matilda Van Zandt, stepped into the household to help raise the children. But for young Jack, this new arrangement would prove to be anything but comforting. The relationship between the boy and his stepmother was cold from the beginning. Some accounts describe Matilda as a strict, demanding woman who kept the Daniel children on their toes with constant nagging. She pushed Callaway toward the ultra-strict Primitive Baptist Church and forced the children to attend as well. Jack went along with it until he was old enough to make his own choices, then abandoned organized religion entirely. But before that day would come, another tragedy struck. During the Civil War, Callaway Daniel joined the Confederate forces. He never came home alive. In 1863, he died from pneumonia contracted while serving as a soldier, leaving his children scattered and his household in chaos. The war left the Daniel family financially and emotionally ruined. They could barely feed themselves. And so Matilda began sending the children away, one by one, to live with other families or to fend for themselves entirely. Jack, the youngest, was among the first to go. He was somewhere between 6 and 15 years old, depending on which historical account you believe. Either way, he was still a child, alone in the world, unwanted by the only family he had ever known. This is the darkness that lurked beneath the success story. The Whiskey King of Tennessee was once an abandoned boy, a runaway from a home where he was never truly welcome. For the next several years, Jack bounced from one charitable neighbor to the next, doing menial chores in exchange for meals and a place to sleep. But times were hard in the South during Reconstruction, and no one could afford to keep the young man for long. He worked in general stores. He swept floors. He did whatever odd jobs he could find. But farming held no appeal for him, and the life of a laborer seemed to lead nowhere. Then fate intervened in the form of a man named Daniel Houston Call. Reverend Dan Call was an unusual figure in the Tennessee countryside. He was a Lutheran minister, a man of God who preached sermons on Sunday mornings. But he was also a businessman who operated a grocery store and, somewhat incongruously, a whiskey still on his property. In the hollow of his farm, smoke rose from the fires that heated the copper stills, and the sweet smell of fermenting grain drifted through the air. When young Jack came to work for Call, he was initially given simple tasks: milking cows, feeding pigs, hauling water from the spring house. He was a chore boy, nothing more. But Jack was curious, and that curiosity would change his life forever. Every day the boy watched men hurrying back and forth from a distant part of the property, their wagons loaded with supplies. He saw the smoke rising through the hollow, but was never allowed to go near it. Finally, after much persistence, Reverend Call agreed to satisfy the boy's curiosity. He took Jack to the place where the smoke came from and introduced him to a man who would become the most important figure in his young life. The Reverend's words, as later recorded in Jack's biography, were simple but profound. "This is Uncle Nearest. He is the best whiskey maker I know of." Nathan Green, known to everyone as Uncle Nearest, was an enslaved man who worked on the Call farm. Born around 1820 in Maryland, Nearest had become renowned throughout Lincoln County as a skilled distiller whose whiskey possessed a unique smoothness that set it apart from anything else in the region. His secret was a process called sugar maple charcoal filtering, a technique believed by many historians to have roots in West African traditions, where charcoal had long been used to purify water and food. This process, which would later be called the Lincoln County process, filtered the whiskey through wooden charcoal chips before placing it in casks for aging. The result was a smoother, mellower spirit, unlike anything produced elsewhere in America. Reverend Call instructed Nearest to teach the young boy everything he knew about distilling, and so began one of the most unlikely partnerships in American business history. A middle-aged, enslaved African-American man and a poor white orphan child, working side by side at a backwoods still, developing a friendship that would transcend the brutal racial divisions of their time. Jack didn't just learn the technical aspects of whiskey making from Nearest Green. According to those who knew them both, Nearest became a mentor, a father figure, perhaps the first person who truly believed in what young Jack could become. Nearest played the fiddle and had a love of music that he passed on to his apprentice, a passion that would stay with Jack for the rest of his life. The Civil War changed everything. When the 13th Amendment ended slavery in 1865, Nearest Green became a free man. But he didn't abandon his work or his friendship with Jack Daniel. When Daniel eventually established his own distillery, he did something extraordinary for that time and place. He asked Nearest Green to be his first master distiller. This was an unprecedented request in the post-war South, where Black Americans faced violent oppression and systematic discrimination at every turn. Yet Jack Daniel looked past the color of Nearest's skin and saw only the man who had taught him everything he knew. Nearest accepted the position, becoming what is believed to be the first African-American master distiller on record in the United States. In 1875, Jack Daniel finally came into his own. After a long legal dispute with his siblings over their father's estate, he received an inheritance that allowed him to establish a legally registered distilling business. The brand label on every bottle of Jack Daniel's today reads, "Established and registered in 1866." But historians have noted that this date may be more legend than fact. Regardless of the exact year, what matters is that Jack had finally achieved what he had dreamed of since his days working at the Call Farm. He had his own distillery. He chose his location carefully. Just outside Lynchburg, he found a hollow fed by Cave Spring, a source of pure, iron-free water emerging from a 2-mile deep cave. This water, naturally filtered through limestone over thousands of years, was the perfect ingredient for making premium whiskey. He purchased the land around the spring and built his operation there, at the very spot where the Jack Daniel Distillery still operates today. The property sat about 5 miles from where Jack had been born, a symbolic distance between the abandoned child he had been and the businessman he was becoming. The early years at Cave Spring Hollow were marked by hard work and careful attention to quality. Jack insisted on using the Lincoln County process that Nearest had taught him, even though other distillers had abandoned it for being too time-consuming and expensive. He selected only the finest corn, rye, and barley malt. He changed the charcoal regularly, refusing to cut corners even when it would have saved money. His motto became simple but unwavering. "Every day we make it, we will make it the best we can." Several of Nearest Green's sons came to work at the new distillery. George, Eli, and Lewis Green continued the tradition of their father, helping to produce the whiskey that was quickly gaining a reputation throughout Tennessee. Later, Nearest's grandsons would join as well, including Ott, Charlie, Otis, and Jesse Green. In all, 7 straight generations of the Green family would work for Jack Daniel Distillery, a legacy that continues to this day. The relationship between the Daniel and Green families was remarkable for its time. Census records show that after the war, the Greens owned sizable plots of land and were wealthier than many white families in the area. Jack Daniel paid his employees based on tenure, not color, a policy his descendants continued long after his death. The two families lived side by side, worked side by side, and broke bread together at a time when such relationships were not only uncommon, but actively dangerous. As his whiskey business grew, Jack Daniel began to transform himself from a simple distiller into a gentleman of Lynchburg. He developed a distinctive personal style that set him apart from everyone else in town. His signature look consisted of a formal black knee-length frock coat, a fawn-colored silk-lined vest, a broad tie, a trimmed mustache and goatee, and that famous wide-brimmed country squire hat. Even if you didn't know who he was, he would have stood out in any crowd. Though he had left school early, Jack received an education thanks to the persistence of Dan Call's wife, Mary Jane. He developed a love of reading and cherished his books, writing his name in them several times so they would always find their way home. He was well-read, thoughtful, and articulate, though he preferred simple pleasures to intellectual pretension. By the 1880s, Jack Daniel's whiskey was gaining recognition far beyond the hills of Tennessee. In 1884, he moved the distillery to its current location at Cave Spring Hollow and purchased the surrounding land. His operation became one of 15 distilleries in Moore County, but it was among the most productive. He introduced square bottles in 1897, a design choice he said represented integrity. "A square bottle for a square shooter," he reportedly explained. The distinctive shape made Jack Daniel's instantly recognizable and became one of the most iconic package designs in American history. Then came the triumph that cemented his legacy. In 1904, at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, Jack Daniel's Old No. 7 Tennessee whiskey won the gold medal for the finest whiskey in the world. The award brought international attention to the small-town distiller from Lynchburg. Orders flooded in from across the country and around the globe. Jack Daniel had accomplished what seemed impossible for a boy who had been cast out of his own home before he was old enough to fend for himself. He had built an empire. With success came the means to fulfill his grandest ambition: the construction of a mansion befitting the Whiskey King of Tennessee. On a bluff overlooking the East Fork of Mulberry Creek, near the old Lynchburg-Fayetteville Turnpike, Jack built his dream home. The brick mansion featured a sprawling front porch, perfect for entertaining guests on warm summer evenings. But the true jewel of the house was the second-floor ballroom, where Jack placed a Steinway grand piano in the corner. This room would become the center of social life in Lynchburg, hosting dances and parties that brought the entire community together. Jack's love of music found another expression in 1892 when he founded the Lynchburg Silver Cornet Band. With $270.70, he purchased a variety of instruments from the Sears and Roebuck catalog and handed them out to musically inclined locals: a bank clerk, a grocer, a policeman, even a lawyer. Everyone in Lynchburg worked for the distillery in some capacity, so it seemed natural for them to gather on Saturday nights to entertain one another. For 20 years, Mr. Jack Daniel's original Silver Cornet Band was a staple of life in Lynchburg, playing at community events, holidays, and gatherings at Jack's mansion. The band played popular music of the turn of the century, gentle melodies that drifted through the Tennessee night without amplification. When Jack opened the White Rabbit and Red Dog saloons on Lynchburg's town square in 1892, the Silver Cornet Band helped attract people from across the county. But the parties at his mansion remained the most exclusive invitation in town. Horses and carriages would line the drive as guests arrived from miles around. Inside, silver trays offered Jack's favorite drink, a tansy julep, or a healthy pour of Old No. 7. The Steinway piano filled the ballroom with music, and couples danced until dawn broke over the Tennessee hills. From the windows of his mansion, Jack could see the lights of Lynchburg in the distance. His distillery had transformed the small town into a thriving community. Mercantile stores, saloons, a flour mill, a barrel factory, a tannery, a tin shop, and 3 blacksmiths all depended on business from the distillery. Jack had become more than a successful businessman. He had become the heartbeat of Lynchburg itself. Yet despite his success, there was one thing Jack Daniel never achieved. He never married. He never had children. Legend paints him as something of a ladies' man, a charming figure who enjoyed the company of young women but never committed to any of them. Some historians suggest he was simply too devoted to his business to make room for family life. Others wonder if the abandonment he experienced as a child left scars that prevented him from forming the kind of intimate bonds that marriage requires. Whatever the reason, Jack Daniel would leave no direct heirs. His empire would pass not to a son or daughter, but to his beloved nephews. Among those nephews, none was closer to Jack than Lemuel Oscar Motlow. Born in 1869, Lem was the son of Jack's sister, Finetta, who had married Felix Motlow. The Motlow and Daniel names had become intertwined through this marriage, and Lem grew up spending time at his uncle's distillery. He had a natural gift for numbers and was soon handling all the bookkeeping for the operation. Jack, who had never married, took his nephews under his wing as if they were his own sons. He taught them the business, shared his wisdom, and prepared them to carry on his legacy. But as the new century dawned, shadows began to gather over Jack Daniel's golden world. The temperance movement was gaining strength across America, and Tennessee was at the forefront of the push for prohibition. Activists denounced whiskey as the devil's poison and demanded that the government shut down the distilleries that produced it. Jack watched with growing concern as the political winds shifted against everything he had built. Then, on a morning in 1905 or 1906, depending on which account you believe, something happened that would become the stuff of whiskey legend. Jack arrived at his office early before the rest of the staff. He needed to open his safe, a sturdy metal box where he kept important documents and cash. But Jack had always had trouble remembering the combination. His nephew Lem usually came early to open it for him, but on this particular morning, Lem had not yet arrived. Frustrated, Jack tried combination after combination, but the lock refused to yield. His temper rose. In a moment of pure anger, he kicked the safe with his left foot, striking it hard with his big toe. The blow sent pain shooting through his foot, but Jack was too proud to complain. He went about his day, ignoring the throbbing injury. In the weeks that followed, the toe did not heal. Instead, it became infected. Without modern antibiotics or advanced medical care, there was little the doctors of that era could do. The infection spread, turning into gangrene. Jack's toe had to be amputated, but the gangrene did not stop. It continued its slow march up his leg, eating away at healthy tissue. His foot was amputated, then his leg below the knee. Finally, his entire left leg up to the hip. The man who had built an empire, who had thrown legendary parties in his mansion ballroom, who had conducted business meetings and charmed guests with his larger-than-life personality, was now confined to his home, his body slowly failing him. Tour guides at the distillery today joke that the moral of the story is never come to work early. Others quip that Jack should have soaked his foot in whiskey, but behind the humor lies a genuinely tragic end for a man who had overcome so much adversity in his life. Some historians, including Jack Daniel's biographer Peter Crass, have questioned whether the safe-kicking incident truly caused his death. Crass points out that Jack kicked the safe in 1905 or 1906, but did not die until 1911, a gap of 5 or 6 years. He suggests that Jack may have suffered from uncontrolled diabetes, which would explain both the slow-healing wound and the progressive gangrene. The safe story, while dramatic, may be more legend than medical fact. Regardless of the exact cause, Jack's health declined steadily after 1906. In 1907, recognizing that he could no longer manage the distillery, he transferred ownership to his nephew Lem Motlow and his cousin Dick Daniel. Dick soon sold his share to Lem, making Lem the sole proprietor of Jack Daniels. On the distilling side, Jack's brother Jess Motlow was named Master Distiller, a position he would hold for 33 years. As Jack's life ebbed away, another threat loomed over his legacy. In 1910, Tennessee became one of the first states to enact statewide prohibition, making it illegal to produce whiskey anywhere within its borders. Lem Motlow challenged the law in court, but the Tennessee Supreme Court upheld it as constitutional. The distillery that Jack had built from nothing, the operation that had won gold medals and international acclaim, was forced to close its doors. On October 9, 1911, at approximately 61 years of age, Jasper Newton Jack Daniel drew his final breath. The official cause of death was blood poisoning, the culmination of years of fighting the infection that had taken his leg piece by piece. He died in Lynchburg, the town he had helped build, surrounded by the family that would carry on his name. Jack left the distillery to Lem Motlow, the nephew who had become like a son to him. But with Tennessee prohibition in full effect, there was no whiskey to be made. Lem would spend the next decades fighting to keep Jack's legacy alive, moving operations to Alabama and then to Missouri, battling legal challenges and political opponents, all while holding on to the hope that someday he could reopen the Lynchburg distillery. The mansion on the bluff did not survive much longer than its builder. Several years after Jack's death, the house caught fire and burned to the ground. Only one photograph is known to exist of Jack Daniel's home, showing the sprawling front porch where guests once gathered and a Tennessee walking horse standing in the yard. Jack's brother-in-law, Connor Motlow, can be seen seated on the right side of the porch. The identity of the man holding the horse is lost to history. Everything else about the mansion, the ballroom, the Steinway piano, the rooms where parties lasted until dawn, exists now only in memory and in the stories passed down through generations. Today, visitors to Lynchburg can see the spot where Jack's mansion once stood, on a bluff not far from where the Jack Daniel's South processing plant operates. The East Fork of Mulberry Creek still flows below, and on quiet evenings, one can almost imagine the sound of the Silver Cornet Band drifting through the Tennessee air. But if the mansion is gone, Jack Daniel's legacy remains stronger than ever. Lem Motlow fought for decades to bring whiskey production back to Lynchburg. He became a Tennessee state senator and led the legislative effort to repeal the state's prohibition laws. Finally, in 1938, a special law was passed allowing whiskey to be made, though not sold, in Moore County. At the age of 69, 29 years after being forced to stop, Lem Motlow resumed whiskey production at Cave Spring Hollow. Moore County remains dry to this day. Visitors who tour the Jack Daniel distillery cannot purchase a drink in Lynchburg, only commemorative bottles to take home. It is perhaps the strangest irony of all. The most famous whiskey in the world is produced in a county where you cannot legally buy a glass of it. Lem Motlow died in 1947, passing the distillery to his 4 sons, Rhaegar, Robert, Daniel Evans, and Connor. The Motlow brothers increased production while remaining faithful to the traditions that Jack Daniel and Nearest Green had established nearly a century earlier. In 1956, they sold the company to the Brown-Forman Corporation for $20 million, equivalent to roughly $190 million in today's money. And what of Nearest Green, the enslaved man who taught Jack Daniel how to make whiskey? For more than a century, his contribution remained a secret known only to the people of Lynchburg. The official company line was that Jack learned distilling from Dan Call. That changed in 2016, when Brown-Forman publicly acknowledged Green's role in helping launch Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey. Today, visitors to the distillery can see displays honoring Nearest Green as the brand's first master distiller, and his story is featured prominently in the official tours. In 2017, entrepreneur Fawn Weaver founded the Uncle Nearest whiskey brand to honor Green's legacy. She purchased the farm where Daniel and Green first began distilling together and established a museum, memorial park, and scholarship fund for Green's descendants. The relationship between the two families, begun so improbably in the hollow of a Tennessee farm, continues to this day. 3 direct descendants of Nearest Green still work at the Jack Daniel distillery, carrying on a tradition that spans 7 generations. The safe that supposedly killed Jack Daniel remains on display in his original office at the distillery. Visitors file past it daily, snapping photographs and listening to tour guides tell the story of the Whiskey King's strange death. Whether the safe kicking truly caused his demise or whether the tale has grown in the telling over more than a century, it has become an inseparable part of the Jack Daniel mythology. Frank Sinatra was buried with a bottle of Jack Daniels in 1998, Lemmy from Motorhead reportedly drank a bottle every day for 38 years. The distinctive square bottle appears in countless films, songs, and television shows, a universal symbol of American whiskey and rebel spirit. Jack Daniel's is now sold in more than 165 countries, making it one of the most recognized brands on earth. But behind the global empire and the celebrity endorsements lies the story of a boy who lost his mother before he could know her, who was abandoned by his stepmother before he was old enough to survive on his own, who found purpose and meaning in the hollow of a Tennessee farm where an enslaved man taught him the art of making whiskey. Jack Daniel built his mansion on a bluff overlooking Mulberry Creek, threw legendary parties in his second-floor ballroom, and created a whiskey that would outlive him by more than a century. Yet he never married, never had children, never built the family that had been denied him as a child. Perhaps that is the truest darkness in the story of Jack Daniel. Not the strange death from a kicked safe, not the fire that destroyed his mansion, but the fundamental loneliness of a man who created joy for millions while carrying wounds that never fully healed. His grave in Lynchburg Cemetery bears the inscription September 1850, a date that may or may not be accurate, marked on a tombstone for a man whose birth records were lost in a fire. Even in death, Jack Daniel remains a figure of mystery. The distillery at Cave Spring Hollow operates today much as it did in Jack's time. Pure, iron-free water still flows from the cave that attracted him to this spot more than 140 years ago. Sugar maple charcoal is still used to filter the whiskey through the Lincoln County process that Nearest Green perfected. The square bottles still roll off the production line, each one bearing the name of a man who stood only 5 feet 2 inches tall, but cast a shadow across American history. When visitors step off the tour bus in Lynchburg, they enter a world that seems frozen in time. The town square looks much as it did in Jack's day. The hardware store that Lem Motlow built in 1912 still stands, bearing the motto, "All goods worth price charged." Miss Mary Bobo's boarding house, listed on the National Register of Historic Places, serves Southern family-style dinners to tourists who have traveled from around the world to see where it all began. But if you walk past the shops and follow the old Lynchburg-Fayetteville Turnpike toward the south, you will come to a bluff overlooking the East Fork of Mulberry Creek. There is nothing there now but grass and sky. The mansion is gone, claimed by fire. The Steinway piano is gone. The ballroom where couples danced until dawn is gone. Only the stories remain. On quiet September evenings, when the Tennessee air carries the first hint of autumn, locals say you can almost hear the sound of the Silver Cornet Band playing in the distance. They say you can almost see the lights of Jack's mansion glowing on the bluff, the horses and carriages lining the drive, the single Oldsmobile gleaming in the moonlight. They say you can almost glimpse a small man in a black frock coat and wide-brimmed hat, standing on his front porch, surveying the empire he built from nothing. Every day we make it, we will make it the best we can. Those were Jack Daniel's words, and they remain the guiding principle of the distillery he founded. But they could just as easily describe his entire life. A boy abandoned by his family became a legend. A poor orphan became a whiskey king. A man who never had children of his own created a family legacy that spans generations. The safe still sits in Jack's old office, its combination long forgotten. The mansion still exists, only in a single faded photograph. The man himself lies in Lynchburg Cemetery, his birth date uncertain, his death the stuff of legend. But the whiskey keeps flowing. The tourists keep coming, and the story of Jack Daniel, the whiskey king who built his empire from the ashes of an abandoned childhood, continues to be told. In the end, that may be the greatest triumph of all, Jack Daniel sought to build something that would last forever, something that would carry his name long after he was gone. He succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. Today, more than a century after his death, people around the world raise glasses of old number 7 and toast to a man most of them will never fully understand. The darkness and the light, the tragedy and the triumph, the abandoned boy and the whiskey king, all of it is woven together in the story of Jack Daniel and his mansion on the bluff. A story that began in the hollow of a Tennessee farm and spread across the entire world. And somewhere in Lynchburg, Tennessee, if you listen closely on a quiet evening, you might just hear the echo of a Steinway piano playing in a ballroom that no longer exists, in a mansion that burned long ago, for a man who turned his deepest wounds into the smoothest whiskey the world has ever known. The safe remains. The legend endures. And the whiskey still flows from Cave Spring Hollow, filtered through charcoal, aged in white oak barrels, bottled in those distinctive square bottles that Jack Daniel believed represented integrity. A square bottle for a square shooter. A lifetime of achievement for a man who started with nothing. That is the dark story of Jack Daniel's mansion. That is the legacy of the Whiskey King. And that, perhaps, is why people still come to Lynchburg, Tennessee, more than a century after Jack Daniel's death, to stand where he stood, to see what he saw, and to taste the whiskey that an abandoned boy and an enslaved man created together in the hollow of a Tennessee farm, changing the world one barrel at a time. The sun sets over Cave Spring Hollow now, just as it did when Jack Daniel first chose this spot for his distillery. The water still flows pure and iron-free from the cave. The charcoal still burns in the rickyard. The barrels still age in the warehouses, their contents slowly transforming into the amber liquid that bears his name. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirit of Jasper Newton Jack Daniel looks down on all of it, the small man with the big dream, the abandoned child who became a legend, the whiskey king whose empire outlived his mansion, outlived his body, outlived everything except the story itself. That story continues to be told. In every bottle opened, in every glass raised, in every toast made to friends and strangers around the world. Jack Daniel wanted to be remembered. He achieved that goal beyond his wildest dreams. But let us return once more to that mansion on the bluff, in the years when it still stood proud against the Tennessee sky. Let us walk through its rooms one final time and understand what Jack Daniel had created there. The mansion was more than a home. It was a statement. When you approached along the drive, the brick facade rose before you like a promise kept. The wide front porch wrapped around the house, offering shade in summer and shelter from the autumn rains. Rocking chairs lined the porch, and on warm evenings, you could sit there and watch the sun set over the rolling hills, the sky turning orange and pink and finally purple as night descended. Inside, the rooms reflected Jack's journey from poverty to prosperity. Fine furniture filled the parlors, purchased from catalogs and shipped by rail from distant cities. Carpets from the east covered the hardwood floors. Crystal decanters held the whiskey that had made all of this possible. On the walls hung framed photographs and artwork that told the story of a self-made man. But the ballroom was the heart of the house. When Jack decided to build a mansion, he knew he wanted a space where music could fill the air and couples could dance. The second-floor ballroom stretched the entire length of the house, with high ceilings that allowed sound to rise and echo. Windows on 3 sides let in light during the day and starlight during the evening parties. The Steinway grand piano cost more than most families in Moore County earned in a year. Jack had it shipped from New York, traveling by rail to Nashville, and then by wagon over the rough roads to Lynchburg. When it finally arrived and was hoisted to the second floor, Jack personally supervised its placement in the corner where the acoustics were best. He hired a piano teacher to give lessons to anyone in town who wanted to learn. Music, he believed, was meant to be shared. On party nights, the ballroom came alive. The Silver Cornet Band would play from one end of the room while couples swirled across the polished floor. Jack himself rarely danced, his small stature making him self-conscious on the dance floor. Instead, he would stand near the piano, watching the festivities with that broad smile beneath his mustache, greeting guests as they arrived, ensuring that everyone's glass stayed full. The parties became legendary throughout Middle Tennessee. Politicians came from Nashville, businessmen from Chattanooga and Memphis, even visitors from out of state who had heard about the Whiskey King and his magnificent home. Jack welcomed them all. He believed that hospitality was a sacred duty, perhaps because he remembered too well what it felt like to be unwelcome in his own childhood home. His sister Elizabeth Motlow and her husband Connor helped host these gatherings. Elizabeth had inherited their mother's grace, and she moved through the parties with an ease that Jack admired, but could never quite replicate. Connor, a practical man who understood the business side of the distillery, kept track of the guest lists and ensured that the right people received invitations. Together, they formed an unofficial family for the man who had never created one of his own. The guest list at Jack's parties read like a who's who of Tennessee society. Judges and lawyers debated cases in the parlor, while their wives discussed fashion in the drawing room. Newspaper editors traded gossip with railroad executives. Farmers who had known Jack since his days as a chore boy rubbed elbows with the wealthy elite who had only recently discovered his whiskey. Jack treated them all the same, with the democratic hospitality of a man who had once been at the bottom of society himself. The food at these parties reflected the bounty of Tennessee. Hams cured in smokehouses, fried chicken that could make a grown man weep with joy, biscuits so light they seemed to float above the plate, pies filled with peaches and apples from local orchards. Jack employed a cook who understood that good food and good whiskey belonged together, and the tables groaned under the weight of her creations. But the whiskey was always the star. Silver trays circulated through the rooms, bearing glasses of old No. 7 neat or mixed with spring water for those who preferred a gentler introduction. Jack's personal favorite was the tansy julep, a variation on the mint julep that featured the herb tansy for a slightly bitter edge. He would hold forth on the proper way to drink whiskey, insisting that it should be sipped slowly, savored rather than swallowed in haste. Outside the mansion, the grounds extended across several acres of manicured lawn. Jack employed gardeners to maintain flower beds and hedgerows, creating an English garden effect that seemed almost out of place in rural Tennessee. A stable housed his horses, including Tennessee walking horses that he bred for their distinctive smooth gait. The single Oldsmobile, the only automobile in Lynchburg at that time, sat in a converted carriage house, a symbol of Jack's embrace of the modern age. From the back of the property, you could see the lights of Lynchburg twinkling in the distance. Jack would sometimes stand there alone after his guests had gone home, looking toward the town he had helped build. The distillery employed most of the working men in the county. The cooperage made barrels. The lumber mills provided wood for the charcoal. The farms grew the corn and rye and barley. The railroad carried his whiskey to the wider world. All of it connected. All of it dependent on the enterprise that Jack had started in a hollow by a spring. What thoughts occupied his mind during those solitary moments? Did he think of his mother, who had passed, giving him life? Did he think of the stepmother who had sent him away? Did he think of Nearest Green, who had taught him everything and given him a purpose when he had none? Did he wonder what his life might have been if he had married, if he had children of his own playing on these carefully tended lawns? We cannot know. Jack Daniel kept his innermost thoughts to himself. He was known as a man of action rather than reflection, someone who expressed himself through his work rather than his words. But in the quiet hours after midnight, standing on the back porch of his mansion with a glass of whiskey in his hand, even a man of action must sometimes feel the weight of all that has been and all that might have been. The years passed, and Jack's health began to decline even before the incident with the safe. He had worked hard all his life, rising before dawn and often not retiring until well past midnight. The stress of building an empire takes its toll on any man, and Jack was no longer young. His hair had gone gray beneath the wide-brimmed hat. His step had slowed. The boundless energy that had propelled him from orphan to Whiskey King was beginning to fade. He began to rely more heavily on Lem Motlow, grooming his nephew to take over the business. Lem accompanied Jack to meetings with distributors and politicians. He learned the secrets of the operation, from the selection of grain to the construction of barrels to the delicate art of charcoal filtering. Jack was preparing for a future that he increasingly sensed he would not live to see. The temperance movement cast a long shadow over those final years. Prohibition seemed inevitable, and Jack knew that everything he had built was under threat. He attended meetings and spoke with politicians, trying to convince them that whiskey was not the demon the temperance crusaders claimed. But the tide of public opinion was turning against him, and even a man who had overcome so many obstacles could not turn back this particular tide. When Jack kicked the safe on that fateful morning, he was already a man diminished. The infection that followed merely accelerated a decline that had already begun. As the gangrene spread and his leg was amputated piece by piece, Jack spent more and more time in his mansion, no longer able to make the daily trip to the distillery. He received visitors in his bedroom, conducting business from his sickbed with the same determination he had shown throughout his life. The parties stopped. The ballroom fell silent. The Steinway piano sat untouched, its keys gathering dust. The Silver Cornet Band played on without their founder's patronage, but the gatherings were smaller now, more subdued. Everyone in Lynchburg knew that Jack Daniel was fading, and the town held its breath, waiting for the end. In his final weeks, Jack's thoughts turned to legacy. He called Lem to his bedside and gave him final instructions. The whiskey must always be made the same way, Jack insisted. Never compromise on quality. Never cut corners. Make it the best you can, every day, as long as the distillery exists, Lem promised. He would keep that promise through decades of challenges, including the long years of Prohibition when the distillery sat silent and empty. Jack also thought of Nearest Green, who had preceded him in passing by about 20 years. He had never forgotten the man who had taught him everything, in an era when Black Americans were systematically denied credit for their accomplishments. Jack had always spoken openly about Nearest's role in creating the whiskey. He made sure that Nearest's sons and grandsons had jobs at the distillery. He ensured that the Green family would always be part of his operation. It was a remarkable stance for a white businessman in the Jim Crow South, and it speaks to the depth of the bond between the two men. When Jack Daniel closed his eyes for the final time on October 9, 1911, the mansion on the bluff entered a new and uncertain era. Lem Motlow inherited the property along with the distillery, but with Prohibition looming, there was little money available for upkeep. The gardens grew wild. The paint began to peel. The parties were a distant memory. and then came the fire. The exact date has been lost to history, as have the details of how it started. Perhaps a candle left burning. Perhaps a spark from the fireplace. Perhaps lightning on a stormy night. Whatever the cause, the flames consumed the mansion that Jack had built, reducing his dream home to ashes and memories. When the sun rose over the ruins, there was nothing left to salvage. The brick walls had crumbled, the roof had collapsed. The Steinway piano, the crown jewel of the ballroom, was nothing but a heap of charred wood and twisted metal. The fine furniture, the carpets, the photographs, the artwork, all of it gone. Only the foundation remained, a rectangular scar on the bluff overlooking Mulberry Creek. Some people say the mansion was never meant to survive its builder. Some say that the fire was the final act of a tragedy that began when a baby boy lost his mother before he could know her. Some say that Jack Daniel, wherever his spirit had gone, simply could not bear to see his home occupied by anyone else. These are the kinds of stories that grow around legends, the myths that accumulate when the facts have been lost to time. What we know for certain is this: the mansion burned, and no one rebuilt it. The property passed through various hands over the decades. Eventually, the Jack Daniel Distillery expanded its operations onto land that had once been Jack's estate. Today, where the mansion stood, industrial buildings process the whiskey that made it all possible. The bluff still overlooks Mulberry Creek, but there is no grand home there now. No porch with rocking chairs, no ballroom with a Steinway piano. Only that single photograph survives, showing the sprawling front porch, the brick facade, the Tennessee walking horse standing in the yard. It is a tantalizing glimpse of a world that no longer exists, a window into the life of a man who built an empire from nothing and watched it nearly slip away before his final days. The story of Jack Daniel's mansion is, in the end, a story about impermanence. The whiskey endures, aged to perfection in white oak barrels, bottled and shipped around the world. The brand grows stronger with each passing year. But the mansion, like the man who built it, has returned to the earth. Brick to dust, wood to ash, memory to legend. Yet perhaps that is how Jack would have wanted it. He was never a man who clung to material possessions. He valued quality over quantity, experience over accumulation. The parties he threw were about bringing people together, not about showing off his wealth. The ballroom was for dancing, not for display. The whiskey was for sharing, not for hoarding. If Jack Daniel's ghost walks the grounds where his mansion once stood, he probably does not mourn the lost building. He probably looks down at the distillery that still bears his name, at the visitors who come from around the world to see where it all began, at the workers who still follow the process that Nearest Green taught him so long ago. He probably smiles that broad smile beneath his mustache and raises an invisible glass to the sky. Every day we make it. We will make it the best we can. That promise has been kept for more than a century and a half. Through Prohibition and World War and corporate acquisition and global expansion, the whiskey has remained true to its origins. The charcoal filtering, the pure spring water, the patient aging in handmade barrels, the distinctive square bottle, all of it traces back to a boy who lost everything and found his purpose in a hollow by a spring. The mansion is gone, but the whiskey remains. The body is buried, but the legend lives on. The safe still sits in the old office, its combination lost to time. And the story of Jack Daniel, like the whiskey that bears his name, only gets better with age.